The following podcast is banned in the state of Florida for talking about a dangerous leftist book, the Bible. Like the Bible, this podcast contains frank discussions on sensitive topics, including sex, violence, and cursing. Please proceed with caution. Your wealth and belongings I will deliver as plunder, without a fee, because of all your sins throughout your territory. I will make you serve your enemies in a land you don't know, for my anger blazes like a fire that will not go out. This is the word in black and red. Hello, and welcome to The Word in Black and Red, where we read the Bible from a leftist and liberationist perspective to elucidate the way people of faith and their comrades can understand the Bible as a source of healing, love, and liberation for all people. I am your host, Micah the Wise Old Llama MB, joined today by the wonderful Elle, our great friend from the Retelling the Bible podcast, W. Scott McCandless, and the Internet's youth pastor, Mason Meninga. Mason, we're so glad to have you. We've been Twitter friends and all sorts of things over the years, and we're really glad to have you here. I even did a brief stint at United Theological Seminary of the West, and we got to know each other a little bit better there. We're so glad to have you here on the podcast. If you'll tell us a little bit about your political tendency, your religious background, and how we can connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, first and foremost. Yeah, in terms of political affiliation, I often think of myself as an anarchist. I think anarchism is a really compelling political ideology to me. And so, yeah, I think of myself in kind of the anarchist sphere. But basically, more than anything, I'm like really open to, all the folks that are more like communist or socialist or whatever it is. Like at the end of the day, I'm like an anti-capitalist. And so whatever broad umbrella you want to throw me under, whatever, as long as it's some sort of anti-capitalist way of thinking. So in terms of religious affiliation, that's a very complicated one. I would imagine a lot of people know me as a ex-evangelical person. And so that's something that a lot of people probably think of me in terms of religious identification. I often describe myself as a Quaker Costal. I'm really compelled by Quakerism and its tradition, as well as I was kind of raised in a somewhat Pentecostal tradition. And I think there's a lot of pieces from that I have a lot of resonance with. But maybe the other way I think of myself religiously is I was really influenced by the emergent church world. The emergent church movement means anything to any of you. And so the emergent church movement is something that's really important. So while no one really describes himself as like an emergent Christian anymore, I still think of myself kind of in that way. I think like emergence and emergent Christianity was a really, really interesting way of thinking about Christianity. So yeah, I guess at the end of the day, I'm a Christian, and you can add all these other little flavors to it. That's who I am. Oh, and then in terms of how to get a hold of me, I have a website, masonmeninga.com. There's one other Mason Meninga in the world, and he is not on the internet at all. So if you find any Mason Meninga on the internet, that's me. So yeah, you can find my website, and from there you can connect to my podcast, my YouTube channel, my Twitter, my Instagram, all the different ways you would want to maybe get connected with me.
Well, Mason, we're so glad that you're here. You also have a podcast that I encourage folks to go listen to.
Yeah, so I would imagine if you're a person listening to this podcast, you might like my podcast called A People's Theology, and I interview lots of different authors and Christian thinkers that are kind of in that liberationist world. So that's something that I've been doing for a number of years, and so there's lots and lots of episodes if you're interested in that kind of content.
Well, Mason, we're so glad that you're here, and Scott and Elle, we are so glad that y'all are here as well. Scott, it was wonderful to hear my favorite podcast and have my weird voice on it as well.
It just belonged. It was great. Thank you for sharing the little phrase with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We'll go ahead and dive on into the second triad of the plagues of Egypt in Exodus 8:20 through 9:12. The Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh as he goes out to the water. Say to him, 'This is what the Lord says. Let my people go so that they can worship me. If you refuse to let my people go, I'll send swarms of insects on you, your officials, your people, and your houses. All Egyptian houses will be filled with swarms of insects, and also the ground that they cover. But on that day I'll set apart the land of Goshen, where my people live. No swarms of insects will come there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I'll put a barrier between my people and your people. This sign will happen tomorrow." The Lord did this. Great swarms of insects came into the houses of Pharaoh and his officials and into the whole land of Egypt. The land was ruined by the insects. Then Pharaoh called on Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, offer sacrifices to your God within the land." Moses replied, "It wouldn't be right to do that, because the sacrifices that we offer to the Lord our God will offend Egyptians. If we openly offer sacrifices that offend Egyptians, won't they stone us to death? We need to go for a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, as God has ordered us." So Pharaoh said, "I'll let you go to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the desert, provided you don't go too far away, and you pray for me." Moses said, "I'll leave you now, and I'll pray to the Lord. Tomorrow the swarms of insects will leave Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. Just don't let Pharaoh lie to us again, and not let the people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." So Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord. The Lord did as Moses asked, and removed the swarms of insects from Pharaoh, from his officials, and from his people. Not one insect remained. But Pharaoh was stubborn once again, and he wouldn't let the people go. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the Hebrews' God, says. Let my people go so that they can worship me. If you refuse to let them go and you continue to hold them back, the Lord will send a very deadly disease on your livestock in the field, on horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, and flocks. But the Lord will distinguish Israel's livestock from Egypt's livestock, so that not one that belongs to the Israelites will die.' The Lord set a tie and said, 'Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land.' And the next day the Lord did it. All of the Egyptian livestock died, but not one animal that belonged to the Israelites died. Pharaoh asked around and found that not one of Israel's livestock had died. But Pharaoh was stubborn, and he wouldn't let the people go. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take handfuls of ashes from the furnace, and have Moses throw it up in the air in front of Pharaoh. The ashes will turn to soot over the whole land of Egypt. It will cause skin sores that will break out in blisters on people and animals in the whole land of Egypt." So they took ashes from the furnace, and they stood in front of Pharaoh. Moses threw the ash up in the air, and it caused skin sores and blisters to break out on people and animals. The religious experts couldn't stand up to Moses because of the skin sores, because there were skin sores on the religious experts as well as on all of the Egyptians. But the Lord made Pharaoh stubborn, and Pharaoh wouldn't listen to them, just as the Lord had said to Moses. So the first thing that I notice here in this story is that Pharaoh is like, "Pray for me," and Moses is like, "Nah, brah," but like in the most passive-aggressive way possible, which we stand here. But as we go through here, we'll talk about each individual plague, also the wider narratives that these plagues are playing into as we go. But what are y'all's initial thoughts here on the plague of the swarms?
I mean, I'm shocked and offended, and I feel betrayed. Because all the, plague information I was getting was coming from, Christian websites. And, the second I go to a Jewish website, it's swarms of animals, not insects. And frankly, I think there's a plague of biting insects, and there's gonna be some locusts. So what are these insects actually doing? There's too many bugs when there are so many other deadly creatures in Egypt just right there. So I'm committing myself to the swarms of animals theory, but I will provide some background ancient Egyptian mythology context for the bug swarms and the swarms of animals. That might take a while. So in every Christian website that has this plague as swarms of flies or whatever, it has a picture of Khepri, who is an Egyptian god with a bug head, but he's not a fly, he's a dung beetle, and it's really weird. All of these websites and sources are associating this plague with Khepri because dung beetles don't bite humans. They're pretty chill. They're kind of cute. They are really important in ancient Egyptian mythology, and I guess you can kind of connect Khepri to this plague because it happens in the morning, and in the path of the sun that the ancient Egyptians were really big about. Khepri is really associated with the morning because scarabs lay their eggs in doo-doo and come out fully formed, and that's like the sun being like born every morning, and that's their kind of association there. Khepri was also a protection symbol and specifically protected kinghood and like the pharaoh themselves. So like, okay, that's that context if we're going with swarms of insects. But if we're doing hordes of wild animals, I think it's a lot more connected to Ammit, which is a demon, not technically a god. But Ammit was incredibly important in the process of like judgment and the Book of the Dead, which is not like a holy book. It's more like, here's your field guide to like the afterlife dead person. And it really connects with each hardening of Pharaoh's heart, because here's the process of judgment in the Book of the Dead. You go into a hall, there's 42 gods, and you have to do a negative confession of sins. There's 42 sins you get asked about, and it's basically trying to prove that you were an honest person. Like, you make statements that say things like, I am not a man of deceit. I have not been contentious in affairs. And, you know, there's some stuff that's like, I have not caused pain, which, like, you can't really know if you've never caused pain, but it's more interpreted as, I have never intentionally caused anyone pain. So you go through the line of 42 gods, making your negative confession, and then your heart's put on a scale and it's weighed against the feather of truth. So your heart's got to be as light as a feather. So with God hardening Pharaoh's heart each time, it actually really plays into Egyptian mythology. So the Hebrew God is using ancient Egypt's own judgment system against Pharaoh in his living life. And that's interesting to me. Like, a hard heart would be heavy, and a heavy heart's not going to be able to pass the feather of truth. And if you don't pass with your heart being as light as a feather, then Ammit, this demon, gets to eat your heart. And you don't get to, like, live out your life in the underworld. And Ammit is a mixture of beasts. They have the head of a crocodile, the forebody of a lion, and the back end of a hippopotamus. So I'm choosing to imagine all of those beasts swarming Egypt, which would be pretty terrifying. Hippos kill more people than anything else. They're like one of the world's deadliest animals, and it wouldn't be fun having a saltwater crocodile like in your living room, and then, you know, lions will just kill you for fun. So that's my theory in the connection. But God's kind of like pointing out that Pharaoh has been betraying the balance of Ma'at, which is like the sacred balance of ancient Egypt's universe. Like, he's betraying that, and that's why everything is running amok and running wild. And I think the swarms of animals would really like hit home. Like, you know, you're really fucking up now.
So the confusion comes from the fact that this word arav, which is my poor Hebrew pronunciation, apologies to my rabbi, that that really got the rabbis into a debate, because arav doesn't necessarily mean insects, it more means mixture. And so, like, there's a swarm, there's a confusion, there's a chaos of some sort of critters, and the rabbis throughout the centuries have debated whether or not it was of flies or of animals more broadly. And so there is this idea that it is wild animals is certainly there, that like there's this invasion of wild animals, that it's very distinct from the swarm that we had just seen of bugs a couple of plagues ago. But this sort of mixture of chaotic things that are everywhere is certainly in the equation. Rashi says that there are evil animals like snakes and scorpions. There's a 10th century Babylonian text, the Sadia Gaon, that says Arav means animals of prey. Rashbam describes them as wolves. And Abraham Ibn Ezra, calls them lions, wolves, bears, and leopards. There's another rabbi, Rabbi Dorothy, who says that it's lions and tigers and bears, oh my.
That was a good one.
Thank you. It was subtle. I worked it in there, But, okay, I can't be the one who laughs most at my stupid joke. Anyway, I do think that it's a very live interpretation here, because it also does bring into the forefront this idea of the Amad, the unbalance of all the nature that is happening because Pharaoh is not respecting the people in the way that he ought to be respecting the people, which is an interpretation I very much so like.
And Pharaoh's not going to be able, Pharaoh is screwing over his own afterlife based on his own beliefs, because if he goes into the afterlife and has to, say a negative confession to all of these gods, he can't really say, I did not purposely cause harm to others, things like that. So when I had the realization that there was that connection to the weighing of the heart, I got goosebumps, because I was like, that's something.
Yeah, I mean, basically all the Hebrew says is that God sent swarms. Doesn't say what it was swarms of, right? So this idea that everything is thrown out of balance, and that even this idea that dangerous animals like crocodiles and hippopotamuses that are supposed to stay in the river, where it all starts, Pharaoh go down to the river, maybe they are swarming out of the river. I can see that. And this idea, I think, of the normal protection, keeping everything in boundaries, is sort of reinforced in verse 23, where God says, I'll put a barrier between my people and your people. So it is God who is setting the barriers, putting things in its proper, what is normally the improper place. So the protections have been lifted from the Egyptians, but have been moved to the Israelites. So I think that's a reasonable way to read it. Swarms of what is certainly an open question. Yeah.
Well, and Ammit is a mixture creature demon. Coincidence? Probably.
But that doesn't get in the way of a good interpretation.
I don't believe in biblical coincidences. I never do.
Yeah, I think that the reason that Christians usually interpret this as being about insects is because in the Septuagint, the word is very clearly translated as a word in Greek that is swarms of flies, specifically gadflies, which are a terrible, monstrous fly, much like mosquitoes, but they're big and gross and nasty. Don't recommend. But one of the arguments that's interestingly made about this is the fact that the plagues, you often see them in these sorts of pairs, where the blood and the frogs directly relate to the Nile, the blood happening to the Nile that then causes the frogs to jump out. In plagues 5 and 6, there's a cattle disease and boils, which is a disease that jumps from the cattle, presumably to the humans. In plague 7 and 8, you have the hail and locust, both things that come from the sky to destroy the crops. And then in the last two plagues, you have the darkness and death of the firstborn at midnight, which are both in this darkness period. And from that, you can say that 3 and 4 should go together, that the lice of the third plague should go with the insects of the fourth plague. But I also think you can make a pretty good argument that what else do lice get into? Animals. So if the lice are coming and affecting the animals, they're coming in here and causing all these problems as well, which then leads to the disease that happens to the cattle and the boils that happen there. Now, in the last episode on the Nile, the ball frog, and the lice, longtime listeners will note that I talked about the fact that I really like an interpretation of this that says that there's a naturalistic response to this, right? That you have the first plague, which is that Pharaoh throws the Hebrew babies into the Nile, causes that blood causes the frogs and or crocodiles and all of those creatures to run away from the Nile, and so they go onto land and begin to die because they're amphibious and can't actually survive the heat that they're facing there in Egypt without the coolness of the Nile. Which then causes the lice and the bugs and all of those things to happen, which then causes an infection of the cows that then brings to the boil. But here in this story, you see where my interpretation there can really be challenged, because the boils are not something that just happens as a natural consequence. They're very specifically the grinding up of ash that then the Lord casts off onto the people that causes these sores and blisters. It is very deliberately God doing this that causes the plague to the people.
The swarms might have helped make a situation where the Egyptians had to start burning things. And then, like, there's an accumulation of the ashes and everything was dirty and gross. I don't know. I'm just trying to support you, Micah, in the naturalist way.
I appreciate that.
I don't dislike that. You know, I don't need to challenge you on this one.
What?
Mhm.
What? Is Elle okay?
I really had not had enough sleep this week, so I'm feeling more passive.
Not feisty enough. Well, we'll come back to that in God's direct action here, because I think it is worth saying that you have these two stories, the lice and the insects, or the lice and the swarms, rather, that are up against each other. And in both of those stories, the Pharaoh does actually relent. The Pharaoh says, yes, you can go out and do these things. And Moses gets ready to start going, and then immediately he gets shut down again.
I mean, Pharaoh is getting some relief, and then he's like, I was just being so silly acquiescing to those slave people. No, you can't go. Back to work. Chop, chop.
The way I read all of these plagues sort of goes into that, because I've come to read these plagues very differently in the last few years. But the other thing, of course, here is that, is Moses lying? Is he saying, okay, we're just going to go 3 days and then we're going to run for it, but he's lying to Pharaoh? Because I think probably what's actually going on here is we have multiple sources, and there is one source in which the story actually is that God only wants the people to go and worship in the wilderness and come back and be slaves again. And that there's another story in here where God wants them to run for it, for freedom, and that different stories have been mixed together. And that's why we have this contradiction. But the way it reads now, Moses is lying, right? He's saying, yeah, we're just going to go out 3 days. We're going to kill a few cows. We'll be right back. And he's lying. Is that how we're supposed to read it?
When God tells you to lie, you lie. Like, if your lie ends up saving people from oppression, lie. You know,
If it's for freedom, you lie. Okay.
you know, just because you're talking to a cop doesn't mean you have to tell them the truth.
Fair enough. Yes.
You know, a lot of people lied in World War II to save other people. So, you know, is lying bad? I think God has at least a biblical precedence where he's like pretty chill with lying.
I can buy into that. Yes.
He likes the trickster. He loves a trickster. All of our favorite heroes are less bad patriarchs. Tricksters.
And yet at the same time, then part of it is, if Moses is being a divinely led trickster here, is Pharaoh basically saying, oh, okay, you can go, but not go too far because I know you're going to run away. Or you can do your sacrifices in Egypt and I'll keep my eye on you. So does Pharaoh know, therefore, that Moses is lying? And is that part of what's going on here? And he's trying to keep him on a short leash here.
In the context of like trying to negotiate things with a boss, yes, the boss is terrified at every second that they're going to uprise and leave, and they're trying to put boundaries on the deal that was not what the employee was initially asking for. So, yeah, I think Pharaoh's like a boss in that way, where they're trying to keep him on a controlled short leash. So you get too much freedom. Like, what do you need the boss for? But
no, I don't disagree. It's just kind of interesting that, in a sense, everyone knows that everyone's lying here and they're acting accordingly. And when there is no trust, there's no possibility of anything good coming out of this kind of thing. You are left with the only outcome is you're going to have to do something rebellious, which of course is where this is all going. But it's that negotiation in an unjust situation I find kind of interesting, because we're all going to be in those kinds of situations sooner or later, and how we handle ourselves in those situations I find kind of fascinating. So
One of the things that I'm glad you guys are like bringing this up. I've never really thought of the Exodus story as almost kind of this like labor strike. And so this is like, oh my, this is an interesting kind of hermeneutic or lens to read this through. But yeah, like I don't really have any thoughts other than the fact that it'd be kind of cool if like we had labor strikes now where like the strikes were just sending out like a plague, at all the bosses, all the CEOs. Like that would be.
Well, General Strike 2028, get churches involved because the strikers need ground support. But when you withhold your labor, you are sending a plague upon the wealthy because they cannot take what you produce. So that is a plague to them. So
So, in Exodus 3:22, it specifically says, "Each woman shall ask her neighbor and any woman living in her neighbor's house for jewelry of silver and of gold and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians." That word plunder there, rob, is another word of putting it there. It is not just, we'll take these things that are given. It is very explicitly, you shall steal these things, and steal the things that your work is what brought to them, right? And so it is. That plunder word there is really important because it is a word that will come up again when it says, "Thou shalt not steal." But here, God is telling the people, you will steal from the Egyptians in a really meaningful way.
God is saying they'll steal from the wealthy Egyptians because it's not going to be the average little scribe who's got a bunch of gold up in their house with a slave, too. That's rich people shit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But speaking of, the Union Revolt kind of thing, I mean, there is no real ethnic identity behind this. This is just a bunch of slaves. And you can certainly understand and read this story as these are the various slaves who have come together from various nations all over and are serving the Egyptians. And this is simply a slave revolt.
Mm.
And there are several mentions of when they leave Egypt, that there are others with them.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily specified. So it may have more to do with solidarity among slaves than it has to do with any sort of ethnic identity at this point. And they simply come together as a people who recognize that this God has saved them from their slavery. So that's definitely one way that you can read the story. It's a slave revolt. That's primarily what it's all about.
In Exodus 3:18, God says to Moses, "They will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us now go on a 3 days' journey into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord.'" And this is all within the context of God saying, "I am going to free you." This is not you're going to go away for 3 days. This is, "I am going to liberate you entirely." And so God, in verse 18, encourages Moses to lie to Pharaoh, and then in 22 to steal from the Egyptians in this way. And that interpretation, Scott, is really helpful because historically we know that there was no major exodus out of Egypt, right? It's very unlikely that we saw something like 2 million people, which is probably around the population of most of the earth at this time, that 2 million people would have been escaping from Egypt. If that had happened, you would see a pretty big permanent record or archaeological evidence that this had happened. And we don't see that. And so we know that actually what's happening...
That's not true, Micah. It's not in the context of, slaves leaving Egypt specifically, but the late Bronze Age collapse has mass migration and this funny group of people we don't know anything about called the Sea People. And there were Canaanites and the Sea People as recorded by Ramses III in his battle with the Sea People.
I think there's really strong evidence that the Israelites were not of the Sea People, but we'll get to that point. The point I'm making is that in addition to what Scott was saying, is that this is a solidarity issue. It's being written by a people much after this scenario. This is not being written by the Hebrews that are escaping from Egypt. This is being written by the tribes of Israel. This story is being told about the tribes of Israel as to why they are a unified front, when in fact they are not very unified around pretty much anything, except possibly that they had been conquered by the same king, or that they had a very similar understanding of the gods and or at that point. God's self. But the actual reality is that probably what happened is that among the Canaanite peoples that had been living in that area, there emerged a subset of those people who began to identify with each other, who began to build solidarity with each other, who began to say, we have these family ties that must go all the way back. And you acknowledge that in the fact that Ephraim and Manasseh are tribes that are a little bit foreign, but they're, we still count them. They're still counted in. They might be the newest comers to the game, but we're all still Israelites, right? And this is what's going to unify us. And so there is this identification of solidarity that happens here and is really important to what will later become the United Kingdom of Israel, as identifying as one people in this really meaningful way that seems, at least according to this story, to be an issue of class solidarity rather than an issue of ethnic identification that the Israelites will later tell themselves is the reason why they are united.
And of course, all of this could have happened during a time when Egypt dominated over Canaan. And so by coming together and forming that common identity around this commonly shared God, perhaps, they somehow felt themselves being moved away from Egyptian dominance up in the hill country where maybe the Egyptians didn't go.
But El, please expand upon the Sea People and and the migration that happened there in the Bronze Age collapse, because I think it is something that's relevant to a lot of the stories that we've been telling.
Well, the late Bronze Age collapse was several hundred years long, and out of it came this mysterious group of people that roamed the seas called the Sea People, who they never left anything themselves archaeologically that we could identify. I mean, there might be something on the bottom of the Mediterranean, but underwater archaeology is pretty difficult, and even the best preserved wrecks might not, they might be sea people, but it just looks like Mycenaean or something, because that's where they left from or whatever. During the late Bronze Age collapse in Egypt, you see the first recorded strike in history, and it might not have been the first one, it's the first one we have, though. And it wasn't by slaves, but it was by the workers of Ramses III, and I feel like I've told this before. This is going to be my Robert Evans, Prussian egg story.
It's important. It comes back often, so it's a little more important than the Prussian egg.
During Ramses III's reign, he had the first general strike. He also dealt with skirmishes with the Sea People, who it's unclear what their goal was, because we only have an Egyptian victory position from that, but in it, there were a bunch of people listed as being part of the Sea People, including some people from the Canaan area. Not necessarily the Israelites, but this is also, way before the Israelites came together as a kingdom, allegedly. So, for me, it's like the story in the Iliad where, Troy existed and there were battles with the Greeks because of the ancient world, like the modern world. We've always been connected, and there's never been, a not globalized point in time once civilization kind of hit. So I always see this story as an echo of a memory that was long forgotten but still gets told in a certain way. The story of the Iliad isn't true, but it echoes of an event that happened that the details were kind of lost in the sauce. So maybe I'm just a little too much on the biblical archaeology side, where I want things to be true too much, but that's my bias and I admit to it, and others cannot.
Yeah, I think that what's really important here is that no matter what's happening in this Bronze Age era, it is the solidarity of the Hebrew people that's ultimately what's happening here, right? Where the people are able to show up, and only if they form a unified front are they able to actually resist what's happening here. If Moses came here and Pharaoh refused again, then they could go back to the Union and say, hey, they turned us down again, and the Union could say, well, we're giving in, and we're done. And the Hebrews seem like they want to do that a couple of times. But God rallies and is like, no, we're going to stay with it. We're going to stay with it, right? and keeps them in the fight for liberation. Because it's really easy to get disappointed. It's really easy to have all the reasons why we aren't going to be able to make a difference. It's really easy to become a doomer, right? And I think it's always been easier to be a doomer than to be someone who has hope. For all of history, I think that since the first, since Adam and Eve got kicked out of the garden, it would have been easier for them to just give up and go, well, we're going to die anyway, so might as well just die right now. And, as much as that is a myth, it is also, I think, true of the earliest humanity, that it would be easier to stay in the cave and die than to go out and hunt that gazelle that is going to run away from you for 40 miles and you're only going to catch it in the 6th day, and and all those sort of things. And it might be easier for you to just die than to try and cultivate that couple of grains on that ear of what we now would call corn, but then were 6 seeds that you're somehow eating, and you're choosing the biggest and fullest of the 6 to crossbreed with the other 6, so maybe next time you get 10. It would have been easier for us to just give up at every point in history. And yet God calls us to hope. God calls us to say, tomorrow I will do this. Tomorrow I will do this. And God here doesn't solve the problem immediately. It takes 10 plagues. And it's not clear that this is happening back to back to back, right? We have some traditions that say this happened in 40 days. We have some that say that it took half a year. But there's no reason to think that this story was happening immediately. There's plenty of reason to think that Moses went on the first year and said, hey, if you're not listening, this is what's going to happen. And then Pharaoh was like, nah, brah. And then the next year he came back when, it was harvest time again and it was going to have the biggest impact. And Moses did it again. And then the next year it came back. There's no reason to think that this happened quickly. But God says, tomorrow I will do this. Tomorrow there will be another step forward. Tomorrow we have reason to hope again, even though God knows that Pharaoh's heart is still going to be hardened.
Not to mention that in the next plague, all the animals in Egypt die,
Mm-hmm.
and then in a future plague, they're all going to die again. So maybe we need to put years and years in there for all of the animals of Egypt to recover so they can be killed again.
Yeah.
because otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that deadly disease, the livestock of the field. I mean, this is, in some ways, I was thinking, how does this reflect the accumulation of power that we see Joseph going through in Genesis 47, when basically the people of Egypt begin this cycle of giving over everything they have to the Pharaoh? And so first off, there's this lack of food, right? And we see that lack of food happening in the first couple of plagues, where the Nile is no longer providing the water to be able to grow the crops that we need. And then there's the frogs everywhere that are getting into the instruments that you use to cook. And then there are the lice that are getting all up in people and causing them all this pain and frustration, so that they're too itchy to maybe go out and harvest the food. And then we begin to see, and that begins here with the famine, right? And then the first thing that Joseph takes in Genesis 47:16, Joseph says, give me your livestock and I will give you the food. And so this second set of plagues really begins to go after the livestock next. The swarms of animals kill them, and then the diseases affect them, until the people of Egypt in verse 18 say, all that's left for my master is our corpses and our farmland. And that death that's happening there in this last plague, the boils that are causing people to die, and then their farmland. They don't have anything that's actually going to be of any worth anymore after all these plagues are done, because everything is dying with the locusts that are about to come as well. And so there's this sort of parallel between what's happening in Genesis 47, where Pharaoh accumulates all of this wealth by taking all of this from the people in the person of Joseph, and here turnabout is fair play, where all of those things are being taken away from Pharaoh and the Egyptians as well.
Yeah, and that was the thing I thought when I read this story, because if you go back to that Joseph story, the Egyptians don't have any cattle. It all belongs to Pharaoh, right? Yeah. So this is actually, if this plague is hitting anyone, it is hitting the elite. It is not hitting the ordinary people of Egypt. And that's one way to understand it. But then it is also kind of surprising that apparently all of these Hebrews who are slaves, who have been so oppressed, apparently they have lots of animals who don't die. And that's a bit surprising, to say the least. And I know that back in the time of Joseph, it said that Joseph and his brothers were exempt from all of this stuff, that Pharaoh took all of their cattle and their possessions and they kept it. But they've since become slaves. And yet apparently they still have cattle and animals who don't die. I'm just saying it's a little bit hard to reconcile that story with this story. These slaves are doing pretty well if they got lots of animals, and their animals don't die, and all of the animals in Egypt are now dead. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But it makes great storytelling. It's just one of those things you can't examine too closely because it gets a little bit contradictory.
Yeah, if you take the hyperbole seriously, it misses the point.
Yeah.
Which is true of a lot of the Bible, but we'll let that just simmer there.
But it's great storytelling.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's far more dramatic to say, and every animal that the Egyptians had died, rather than, and they saw a 27% decrease in the births that were happening.
Well, now it's back to Egyptian mythology time. So the death of the livestock is generally associated with Hathor, who was a major goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. She was consort to Horus and Ra eventually, who are both like pharaonic symbol gods. More temples existed to her than any other god, and she was always represented in the temples of her male consorts. But I don't think this plague is really about her. I think it's about her son, who is a literal bull named Apis, and he's significant because his role was to be sacrificed and reborn and be an intermediary between humans and powerful deities. Notably, Ptah, who is a creator god who crafted the world. So I just think it's kind of interesting all the cattle die, and the bull literally represents Pharaoh, and it kind of takes away all this like spiritual support from the Egyptian pantheon deities. And Apis was considered the manifestation of the king, because bulls were symbols of strength and fertility, both linked with kingship. Strong bull of his mother Hathor is a common title for Egyptian gods and male kings, and it was never used for a woman serving as a king like Hapsat should. So I just, mythologically wise, I think this plague is more about Apis and Pharaoh being knocked down more, because like W. Scott said, this is a plague that's going to affect the wealthy. Like, this is a rich person's plague. If it's the Pharaoh's plague, particular, if the Pharaoh still owns all this cattle. So the Egyptian mythology, not that the writers of this would be like super familiar, but like if they had some familiarity with this, like that just, it adds so much spice to it.
Well, and, you know, as Scott was talking about the livestock question here, like how much livestock would the Hebrews actually have had? Well, why does Pharaoh need to hear rumors that none of their animals had died? They didn't have enough animals that, like, they were out grazing the flocks. They didn't have enough livestock that it was noticeable that only the Israelites were there. It was only through rumors that Pharaoh heard Pharaoh asked around and found out that not one of Israel's livestock had died, which says to me that there probably weren't a lot of livestock that they actually
It was their
had.
4 chickens they all shared.
Yeah, exactly. It was, it was the one pet cat and the 2 donkeys and a couple of cows and a couple of chickens. And I say that a little bit jokingly, but a lot of ancient homes were built, especially in the Middle East, so that you had a lower level, which is where the animals would live underneath the house, and then you would have the above floor where the humans lived. And that sort of separation happened all the time. I'm now looking at Elle, who seems to be disagreeing with me, and I'm not suddenly not confident.
No, so there are homes like that all over the world. Like, that's how a medieval Italian farmhouse would be built. The animals being below would heat the rest of the home, and it's more convenient.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was space efficient.
Yeah, my wife and I were driving through a random area that we'd never been to before, and there was a Arabic name air conditioning company, and I said, that seems fitting. They've been doing it for about 6,000 years. And so, like natural air conditioning that you need to have in the desert is a feature here. So, maybe it's not the livestock that you would have enough to have a whole field and have land. Maybe it's just the couple of livestock that you were able to keep in your house and feed around you that you were able to hold on to. And maybe, in fact, the reason that the livestock survived is that there was some huge infection that happened to all of those free-range cattle and all those free-range horses and donkeys and flocks. But the couple of sheep that were left underneath your house to make sure that you stayed warm at night, they survived because they weren't around the sick ones, and so they didn't catch the infection that happened there. And so it was only the poor people who couldn't afford to put their livestock out whose livestock actually survived.
Which is exactly why the bird flu is spreading through factory farms right now, and they're killing millions of chickens right now. Yep. Speaking of plagues.
That's true. I was reading something that said the reason that the Hebrew livestock didn't die is because they brought in their animals, and that was specifically mentioned as there's it, that's the reason. All you had to do was bring them in, but you didn't.
Yeah, but the rich people, one, wouldn't want animals in their houses because sheep herders are dirty and below us and beneath us, so we're not going to have those animals inside our house, as we've previously established. They don't want these critters in their home. And B, they have way too many flocks for them to be able to fit into their house. How are they supposed to fit 600 head of cattle into their house?
And they also may live super far away from that because, How many rich people do you know that have a horse and it's in 3 counties over in a stable that they go visit just during horse riding season?
Yeah, and so there are very practical reasons why the livestock of the poor would have survived and the livestock of the rich would not have. That people who had invested in these huge shows of wealth, who had invested in these factory farms, as Scott helpfully points out to modern plagues, would not have necessarily survived, but the very meager things that people did have would have survived. And probably were the ancestors of all of the other animals that would come back to live throughout the land of Egypt, that I'm assuming the Egyptians probably stole from the Israelites and took from them because this was happening. And we're going to bring that connection back to modern plagues that I think is a really good conversation to have. But first I want to talk about the skin sores and blisters, because this is another area that is really interesting. Because again, as we've talked about, Egypt is a very clean culture. A big reason why a lot of Egyptians were shorn from head to toe was because they didn't want lice to be crawling around their bodies, which makes sense. And given how much we had talked about lice being just part of everyday experience in an earlier episode, I would also probably... I'm a very hairy person, and if there was lice all the time, I'd probably shave all my hair off too to try and avoid it. And so the fact that this ash gets over the people is really a huge whack in the face to a culture that is very much opposed to being dirty in this way. So maybe what's happening here in this story is that the Hebrews are actually beginning to resist. Maybe they've, happening in between the text here is that
refusing to clean up all the cattle corpses
Yeah.
because they're not ours. Where you want us to, or the Egyptians burnt all these corpses, and that's how all the ash got everywhere. There we go.
Exactly. You have to do something about about what's happening here, and you have to do something about all these dead bodies. And they've learned from the last couple of plagues that if you just leave them, then there's going to be a whole big bug problem. And so they go and burn all of these bodies, and suddenly there's ashes everywhere, and the ashes turn to soot all over the whole land of Egypt.
So what's really funny is the National Institute of Health's website has a page on this plague, trying to theorize what caused it. And they kind of go over all the occupational hazards of like having soot on you and the cancers it causes, which are mostly skin cancer. But like that's like a longer period of time than, you know, the ashes go up and you're covered in boils. Also, skin cancer doesn't really present as a boil. But one of the things that the National Institute of Health suggests is that it could be like maybe skin anthrax. And like maybe the cattle died of anthrax and just all those ashes were full of anthrax.
Oh, goodness.
But not going the naturalistic route and going back to the Egyptian mythology side of it, this one is supposed to be connected to Isis, who, you know, she's major boss babe of the Egyptian pantheon, deeply associated with resurrection. She actually took some of like Hathor's thunder right around, if we called this period the Middle Kingdom, which would be late Bronze Age collapse time period, it would have been around this time that Isis stole a bunch of Hathor's thunder and like took her role in a lot of like big mythical ways. Isis is the most magically powerful of the Egyptian gods. So when it talks about the magicians again, specifically in this one, that's like a laser beam like pointing at Isis and like sort of the feebleness, the powerlessness of the Egyptian control over this natural world again. So that was pretty cool. It was pretty good.
Yeah, and this is once again one of those contests between Aaron and the magicians, right? Where the magicians are trying to get one over on Aaron, and this time they really can't do it. They were able to do the snakes out of the rods, and they were able to turn the Nile into some more water into blood and all that sort of stuff. But this, they're so affected by the sores and the blisters that they aren't even able to do the magic. They can't even like get up to perform the spells.
They can't stand before the pharaoh, which is sort of their role. Yes, they're to be there, and they can't even stand up because presumably they got boils on their feet. Yes.
Yeah.
And Isis's healing spells aren't affecting them, so they're not going to affect anybody else.
Yeah.
I did some work on this plague. I actually wrote an episode about this that I never recorded. Roundabout, you remember sometime after COVID, there was a lot of talk about monkeypox. Do you remember monkeypox?
Yeah.
That was the
that TikTok trend.
Well, it wasn't. No, it was a disease.
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It just, in terms of like its existence in my memory, it's like the length of a TikTok trend of like.
Yes,
like
it was a short-lived.
Maybe 2 or 3 months. Yeah,
it was somewhere between COVID and bird flu and everything else, but it was a virulent disease that was spreading. And the thing that strikes me about it in this context, though, when you think of a pox, it is something that spreads within populations, just sort of like COVID, which we obviously learned a lot about virulent diseases through that one. It tends to spread primarily among poor neighborhoods where people are crammed together or where people are forced to work in close quarters. That's where these things particularly spread. And so it's actually something that happens when you have built your economy in such a way as to have a permanent underclass who you put into ghettos or you put into close quarters. And that's where these diseases start, and they spread throughout the country. And so one way to understand this is it's simply an outgrowth of this whole slave economy that the Egyptians had built by having this permanent underclass who they were forcing to work together in close quarters. This was just rife for this kind of disease to start there and to spread throughout the whole country. And that's another way to understand it too.
Yeah, and also a disease that perhaps because the poor people had already been living in these camp corners, maybe they were immune to it. Maybe they had been living next to these animals that caused this sort of disease. Maybe it's a cowpox kind of situation where farmers that lived around cows were not as likely to develop cowpox as people who were just coming in and getting these diseases who had not been around it. And so maybe
yet
again
they can carry it and give it to the other people. Yes,
exactly.
and they suffer from it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so perhaps there's a natural immunity that is happening here, or not a natural immunity, but a vaccine-like immunity, because you've been dealing with a small version of this for a long time, and it just affects the wealthy. And so it's once again one of these consequences of the oppression that they have sought that it ends up hurting people so badly.
This sort of brings me to sort of this overall view of these plagues. Like, I'm older than you guys, I think. I've been around, I've been dealing with these stories for longer than you.
Yeah.
And I remember reading these plagues, and they were totally at a distance. They had nothing to do with me. This was something that was in ancient times. And yet, over the past, 4 years, I feel like we've been living through one plague after another, COVID. Yep. I'm living here in Canada. Canada was on fire last summer, and it's going to be on fire this summer. This is a plague. It's, our cities are filling with smoke. Our air quality has gone to hell, So we are living with one plague after another. We have COVID, we have monkeypox, and we have bird flu. They have killed, I heard the report, millions, I think this was in the States, millions of chickens today, because of this plague, which is fed by factory farming, one plague after another. And we understand a lot more about the causes of these plagues, but we also understand what it is to live through these things. And one thing, I don't know, as I read these stories, I'm getting a lot more sympathy for Pharaoh, honestly, because, here I am. I'm part of a privileged population. I'm a white old guy, I guess, relatively privileged and living through this stuff. And so I can kind of identify with Pharaoh to that extent. And how would I see Moses? Moses is this crazy guy with long hair and a ragged garment who came in from the desert and is screaming about some god that I've never heard of, who has sent this plague or is going to send this plague. Why on earth would I listen to him? Why on earth would I listen to this crackpot? Even if occasionally he seems to be right, he doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. But you know what? These magicians, these expert guys, man, I'm going to listen to them until they can't stand before me because they got boils on their feet. But so I kind of wonder, who are these magicians? Who are these experts? Are they our medical officers of health who have been apparently these wise people who guide us through these plagues? And yet we also know that they've sometimes lied or at least fudged the truth, or they haven't necessarily told us the truth, and they don't necessarily inspire a lot of confidence because of some of the lies that have happened. Or are they the conspiracy theories who are out there hawking their wild cures, their ivermectin and all of this stuff? And how are we supposed to see these magicians? I've come to see these plagues very differently. And I'm kind of understanding where the Egyptians are coming from. Because, living through these plagues, one after the other, I know that tendency to want to say, deny this and say, oh no, it's going to be over. Couple of weeks, we'll shut things down. Everything will be fine. I know what it is to think, oh, the world's not falling apart and everything's going to be okay. And then the next disaster comes along. We've all been there now. I've come to see these plagues a little bit different, but I'm still anti-slavery.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Yeah, I just want you to know that. But, yeah.
I feel like it is really useful whenever we are reading these stories to always remember that our tendency is to read ourselves as the good guys in the story, but the reality is that most of the time we are the bad guys in the story, right? And that's not to say that, humanity is evil, but most of the time, the people who are doing the oppression are the people who have the privilege to read this book, right? Most of the time. And so, especially as a white person who is mask presenting, I need to be reading this story and saying, well, how am I being like Joseph? How am I being like Pharaoh? How am I being like the Egyptians here? Which is really helpful. As you were saying, who is this Moses guy? I was just thinking, well, Moses is a Dutch 16-year-old who refuses to go to school until we finally listen to her, right? And all of these plagues that we're talking about, well, the plague is pretty obvious what's happening. They're rooted in climate change. And so who are the people who are being our magicians to try and say, well, it's not actually going to be that bad. We'll survive. If we just add more to the army, then we'll be able to survive the climate catastrophe. Or, if we just do these things. And your point on, the medical officials, well, I absolutely believed in Fauci a lot of the time. And then Fauci was perfectly willing to screw us over, so the businesses came back, right? And the medical establishment had to compromise with business interests in order to make sure that the quote-unquote economy kept working, where the economy meant the wallets of the people who ultimately are in charge of our government and who run the corporations that make all the decisions that our government makes. And so Fauci can be an absolutely trustworthy guy and also exist within a power structure that is subject to the power of the wealthy and is willing to manipulate things so that the pharaohs of our time don't actually have to compromise the way that they live and the wealth that they are taking in.
And somehow, throughout all of these disasters and plagues, somehow the rich just manage to get richer and the poor just fall further down, and that's everybody's fault. But yeah,
absolutely. And over again, and in this story, the plagues are directed by God, and so they are affecting the people who are supposed to be affected, right? There's a justice that's going on here. You caused this problem, so you're getting what comes to you. But in our world, in the reality that we live in, most of the worst effects of these plagues are not hurting the people at the top. They're hurting the rest of us, right? And the only way that that is going to change is if we begin to stand up for each other and say, no, actually, we're not going to let you continue to do this. We're going to change the way that things are being done. And we're going to unite together to make sure that the worst effects of this affect all of us, not just us, who otherwise have no power if we stay divided against each other.
Going back to what you said a little bit earlier, the only way the poor are really going to be able to survive these ongoing troubles, these plagues, is to build the solidarity to take care of each other. It's not just standing down the authoritarians who say, no, we're not going to do anything. It's defying them and actually taking care of one another. Because, imagine healthcare workers banding together, and instead of charging people for healthcare, they just stop doing that part of the paperwork.
Yeah.
So that way people could be taken care of, and it's still technically a strike.
Yeah.
They're just not hurting the patients by denying them the service.
Yeah, imagine us. We're living in a world where we're going through one plague after another. The only thing that gets these people through is they stick together and they stick with their God. That's it. They're living through the world falling apart too, but somehow because they stick together, they're surviving it, and it's going to lead to something good for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many ways to stick together, right? It can look like joining the IWW and beginning to prepare for the general strike that's coming in 2028, which everyone needs to do. And I think is your ethical obligation as a Christian and as a leftist to go and do. to begin organizing that sort of solidarity, that campaign to ensure that we are all taken care of. And if you're not the kind of person who likes to sit through a meeting, go start a garden and begin gardening things so that when the general strike happens, we have the vegetables and the produce to survive it. And when the inevitable heat strikes that begin to destroy our ability to create vast monocultures in the middle of the country, or our transportation systems begin to shut down, or all of those other things begin to happen as an inevitable result of the way that we are careening towards inevitable climate catastrophe, that we can survive in our local areas, that we can turn our manicured lawns into something that actually produces something that's good for humanity rather than a symbol of wealth. All of these things, going out and helping your elderly neighbors, going out and giving away the extra stuff that you have in your house, which will help you to declutter and also help someone else who actually needs it, going out and making art and forming friendships and listening to other human beings, all of those things are going to help us build the solidarity we need to survive the plagues that are currently coming. It's not doomeristic to say, hey, the climate catastrophe is coming. In 100 years, there will either be humanity surviving or capitalism surviving, and capitalism can't survive without humans, and so we have to make a choice. Which of those two we really want to see survive? And that means we have to form the communities that are actually going to survive it. People have faced the downfall of their civilization, the repeated plagues that are coming against them, the catastrophe, the end of the world, since the beginning of the world. And we have survived it because we come together. And we will only survive it if we continue to do so. Scott, Elle, Mason, thank you all so much for being a wonderful part of this podcast. I so appreciate all of you. Thank you all so much for your wonderful contributions. And thank you, dear listener, for forming this community and helping us to grow to be something bigger. I hope that it is a source of hope for you. I hope that it has become a community where you are able to build solidarity with others. And I hope that you will share it with others so that it continues to be a source of solidarity for them as well. As always, go and listen to Retelling the Bible podcast, and then go and listen as well to Mason's wonderful podcast, The People's Theology. Highly recommend those wonderful shows. And if you are someone who is interested in coming and being a part of this conversation, reach out. Email me, and we'll make sure that you are able to be a part of these conversations as well, because a liberationist perspective on the scripture requires all of us, and that includes you. So, thank you all. I so appreciate you. Pastor Micah, take it away.
And thank you, Future Micah. The Word in Black and Red is a ministry of the Lamapak Alternative Church, a home for everyone left on the outside. Your contributions help this working-class project invest in better tools and spend time organizing, recording, and editing this podcast. And hey, if you support this 16-year project, we might even get it done this decade. We use Patreon for now, but keep an eye out for when we switch to a more ethical way of supporting the show. You can join in the life of our community in our wonderful Discord, where you can chat with the folks who've heard this episode, find links to purchase our merch, and participate in a spiritual community for everyone seeking to build the kingdom of God. We're also a fun follow on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr, and Reddit. You can find the Discord, Patreon, and all the other ways to connect with us and these wonderful co-hosts in the show notes. Now, Future Micah, say the profound shit.
And thank you, Pastor Micah. Now go. And know that the gods of kings and pharaohs have been defeated by the God who stands in solidarity with the poor. And so be on that God's side. Stand in solidarity with your fellow human being. And together we will survive the plagues to come. Shalom.